Okay. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the morning session of the Introduction to Python for Data Science, which is our third workshop, part of the Introduction to Data Science workshop series that the KAUST Visualization Core Laboratory is putting on this semester to help build capacity in the core tools for doing data science and machine learning here at KAUST, and to anyone else who might be joining us today from outside KAUST. So my name is David Pugh. I'm a staff scientist in the KAUST Visualization Core Laboratory. And I'm also a certified instructor with software and data carpentry, who have provided in part, the course materials for Python that we'll be using today, and the course materials for most of the other courses that I'll be teaching as part of this workshop series as well. I'm joined today by my colleague, Lyndon Holst, who's also a staff scientist in the Visualization Core Lab. So he'll be kind of helping out today, answering questions on the Zoom chat, or answering questions that he might post on Gitter, or kind of any other way that he can help out today. So I'm very happy to have the extra help with Q&A. This session is being recorded. And the recording will be available probably tomorrow on YouTube. There'll be two parts. There'll be the morning session, which we're in now. Then the afternoon session will be recorded. So there'll be two videos available on YouTube probably tomorrow. And the course materials, I'll put links in the video description on YouTube to all of the important links that I've shared already today: the course materials, course repo, Gitter channel, things like this. In case you lose them or forget them. So they'll be there. And so you can kind of go through this course again, or bits and pieces, as much as you want. Okay. So at this point, I want to go ahead and get started. So I'm going to share my screen. Okay. So the first thing I want to do is just a quick kind of schedule of events for the day. So we're going to start with a discussion of a tool called Conda. It's going to be a very brief discussion. Prior to the recent pandemic, I would teach this course live in person, and we would do local software installs for everyone in the workshop. And Conda is a big part of efficiently getting everybody set up with a software environment that is independent of whatever software they have on the system, that will run the tools that we're going to use in the workshop today. Conda is also an integral part of any machine learning or data scientist's data science kind of workflow, tool stack, software stack. I have a whole course on Conda that I taught last Tuesday afternoon. The recording is on YouTube now. So you can go back and reference that. I'm just going to kind of summarize the highlights of that and just remind everybody the important features of Conda, and also what, for those of you who didn't attend Conda last week, kind of an idea of what you missed. And then the rest of the morning session is going to be about either very basic intro to Python things. So that's episodes 2, 3, 4, and 5. Basics of running and quitting, starting notebooks, and things like this. Variables and assignment, data types, built-in functions, this kind of thing. And then we'll have a short break. And then after the break, it's going to be mostly focused on pandas and plotting. So we'll do a little bit of data analysis with pandas data frames, and then some plotting with matplotlib. And then we'll have a break at around lunch for about an hour. And then when we pick up after the break, we'll talk about some slightly more advanced topics. So we'll talk about for loops, conditionals, looping over data sets, like the kind of thing that you would normally use Python to do as part of your research work or your data science, data or machine learning work. And then we'll end the day with some topics on best practices and programming style. And then I will try to leave some time, about 30 minutes at the end of the day, for any just kind of general Q&A you guys might have. Okay. So let's go ahead and get started. So if you're interested in getting a local setup installed, so there's a link here to setup instructions. So this explains how to download Miniconda or Anaconda and get everything kind of set up on your local machine and to replicate the software environment that we're going to be using today. So those setup instructions, coupled with what we're about to discuss in the Getting Started with Conda episode, should be enough to help you get started with replicating the software stack locally that we're going to be using in this workshop. Again, if you the binder resources are always available, so you can just go back and click those links. They'll work. They're not just live for today, they're kind of just generally live, so you can also go back and run the setup on binder if you want. Okay, cool. So let's get started with Conda. So in this episode, I want to give you a very quick and very brief kind of overview of why you should use package and environment management system. Like, what problems does it solve as part of your data science and machine learning workflow? I'll just mention briefly what is Conda and some basic best practices on project organization. And mostly, I guess this is just to get you interested enough in Conda that if you missed last week's lesson or workshop, that you do take the time to go back and either watch the workshop or go through the teaching materials to learn how to use Conda. It has been probably the most important tool for me personally in terms of growing as a machine learning engineer or data scientist, learning to use Conda to create project-specific environments for my research work and my work with other clients, and then to use Conda to manage all the dependencies within each of those projects so that I can both reproduce my work and also share my work with colleagues, and then port my work from my laptop and my workstation to systems like Ibex or Shaheen or AWS or GCP or things like that. Okay. So this is just a taster, but it hopefully will be enough to pique your interest. So here's the super condensed version of this lesson. This is kind of my general recipe for every machine learning or data science project that I do. So every project has its own directory. So if you are familiar with Bash, you'll recognize this make dir command. So we're not going to be using any Bash commands today. This is all about Python. If you want to learn more about Bash, you can go to the shell training that we did earlier this semester is also on YouTube, so you can go through those course materials if you want. But you should make a separate directory for every project, and then inside that project, you're going to create something called an environment file, an environment.yaml, which uses a particular syntax called YAML. And it's just a structured text file where you basically list out all of the dependencies for your project and where Conda should look to install those dependencies from. And then once you have that environment file, then you can use Conda to recreate your software stack from that single file. And that's what this command here will do. So this one command basically creates a software environment for your project based on the contents of this environment file, and then puts it into a directory inside of your project's directory. So you have your own little software stack that lives in a directory that's just a folder inside of your project, all right there. And then you activate your environment. And environment activation is what allows you to kind of have different environments and different entire software stacks installed on your computer, and then kind of switch back and forth between these. That's kind of like you activate an environment and you deactivate an environment to kind of switch back and forth between these two, or between your different environments on your system. Now, of course, you can go back and you can, if you forgot to add some kind of a dependency, or you need to change a version number or something, you can make little edits to this file, and then you can run a command to update your environment based on the contents, the new contents of your environment file. And when you're done working, you can deactivate the environment, go do something else. Okay. So that's kind of the general recipe. Now, obviously, the details of what each of those commands do is covered later in this episode and in much more detail in the Conda training that we did last week. So that's the kind of the too long, didn't read version of this episode. Okay. So let's go back to the motivating questions. So why should you use a package and environment management system at all, much less Conda? And the reason for this is that basically it's really hard to install software, particularly scientific software. It's complicated. There are a lot of moving parts. You have to make sure the dependencies match up. You might have environment variables that need to be set properly. You might have things that need to be compiled. You might have a whole bunch of other things. And that's just for like whatever software you're installing. You know, if you, it's very common to run into a whole host of problems in this area that can quickly get you just massively confused and befuddled, and it's a pain in the ass, and it's difficult to sometimes make progress on what you really want to do, which is your work, your research. Okay. So typically, you install software system-wide, and there's a number of drawbacks with this. So one is that it's difficult to figure out what software is actually required for your project. So when you have your project and your code just kind of works on your machine, but you don't have any kind of isolation around the software that you're actually using for your project, it's actually difficult to figure out necessarily exactly what your project depends on to run and what software it doesn't depend on. So without isolating your software stack within a project-specific environment, it's difficult to understand what is actually required for that project. If somebody else wanted to reproduce your work, or if you wanted to share your work with somebody else. If you don't have this kind of environment isolation, it's really difficult to install different versions of the same software at the same time. There's still a lot of scientific software that requires Python 2, for example. So if you wanted to have different versions of Python installed on the same machine, then that's difficult unless you use some kind of environment manager to allow you to isolate the different versions of Python from one another. So installing things system-wide, you have a research project, all the software works, you finish that research project, or mostly finish it, and then you start another research project. This research project needs newer versions of the software, so you update the software on your system, work on your new research project for a while. Then your PI or somebody asks, you know, can I get you to regenerate that figure or rerun that analysis from your old project? And you go back to your old project and you try to run the analysis, and it breaks. And it breaks because it only worked on the older versions of the software. Now you've updated to the newer versions of the software. So then you have to kind of revert all of your software installation, if that's even possible. Or you've got to update your code on your old project to work with the new versions. And that's a real pain. You don't want to have to do that. So environment isolation helps you kind of solve all of these problems. But within this kind of environment isolation, you still have to manage software installation. You still need to manage dependencies of your software. So when you install everything, it works. And that's what a good package management system does. So if you're used to using Linux, then Linux has their OS system package managers like apt or yum, depending on your flavor of Linux. There's a homebrew project for Mac. there is a new project that is out for newer versions of Windows that provides some kind of a package manager for Windows. I don't have a link to it here, but that's the basic idea, is that you want a tool that allows you to say, I want, this small list of software to be installed, and then that tool should manage installing all of the dependencies and the dependencies of that software so that it just works. That's what you want from a good package manager. And I already talked a little bit about environment management. So Conda is basically a single tool that solves both the environment management problem and the package management problem. And that's what makes it so powerful and particularly useful. And it also works for not just Python, but pretty much any programming language. So it's programming language agnostic in that sense. And that's really useful for scientific research, data science, machine learning, because these workflows are often depend on multiple programming languages. So a lot of the Python libraries that you will use for doing machine learning and data science are actually wrappers around C, C++, Fortran code, or GPU accelerated CUDA code, or actually on a lot of visualization libraries or Python wrappers that take your Python code and transpile it into JavaScript to use JavaScript plotting libraries. Bioinformatics, genomics workloads are typically a huge mix and match of everything, including Java. So Conda allows you to manage all of these multi-language dependencies in a single tool. So just to clear up some confusion, so there is the Conda tool, which is what the commands that you write when you use Conda are like Conda install or Conda environment create. So Conda is the tool. Mini Conda is the smallest installer for the Conda tool. So this is what I recommend that you download, and this is what the setup instructions kind of show you how to do. To install Mini Conda, which contains the Conda tool plus its own version of Python so that it doesn't rely on your system Python. And then some operating system specific packages, because Conda works on Windows, Mac, or Linux. So there's going to be some specific packages that it will need to interact depending on what your operating system is. So that's just Mini Conda. Anaconda is everything that's in Mini Conda plus, at this point it's like well over 2, maybe close to 300 packages that include very much targeted at like the data science, machine learning, and scientific computing community. So it includes like all of the core libraries that you would want. And you can install Anaconda, and that's fine. But I don't use Anaconda myself because I really want to encourage you to adopt this kind of project-specific workflow where you have a different software stack for each project that you manage using the Conda tool, in which case it doesn't make as much sense to install the Anaconda distribution and have everything in one place. Okay. So there's some instructions here on installing Conda, and in a live workshop we would actually kind of go through this, and I would help make sure everybody gets Conda installed and things like that. But with such a large group virtually, it's just much more efficient use of time to take advantage of our BinderHub JupyterLab instances. So that's what we're going to be doing today. But there are some pretty good instructions here on how to do all of that. How to check the Conda version, and how to make sure you have the most recent version, and then managing Conda environments. So at this point, I'm going to refer you back to either the course materials from last week, which are available online, the video from last week, which is on YouTube. But this section basically just kind of walks you through step-by-step, creating a new project directory, changing into that directory, creating an environment file. So this is what an environment file looks like. It has, has a name, and then you list out your dependencies, and you can put a version number. Like here, I've said I want to have Python 3.8 installed, but I'm happy to have the most recent compatible version of Matplotlib and Pandas, which is what Conda will do in the event that you don't provide a version number. And and some tips and tricks and exercises and things like that. Activating the environment, updating the environment, and how to get the data. So I went through that very quickly. I just wanted to give you kind of a taste of motivate Conda and kind of really motivate you, if you haven't already, to go back and look at the course materials from last week. But fortunately, we don't have to do any of this, because in our Jupyter lab, I have created an environment file that has everything that we're going to use today. And this one is a bit more involved than this kind of the short example that I showed you in the teaching notes. But we're still here listing the dependencies. And we list some channels. So this basically just tells you, tells Conda where to go to look for packages to install and in what order. So there's a nice channel called Conda Forge, which is a community-driven repository. And then there's the default channel, which is managed by the company Anaconda, which distributes the Conda tool and the mini Conda and Anaconda distributions. They have their own channel where they have packages. And then these are the different versions that we're using. And then we have some stuff that's installed via pip. So we can list those in this requirements.txt file. And then these configuration files is what Binder uses to create the software stack and environment that we're actually using. So the fact that I have listed Jupyter Lab 2.2, that's where the Jupyter Lab that we're actually using on Binder, that's the version of Jupyter Lab that we're using. And I've installed pandas because we're going to be using pandas later today. I've installed matplotlib because we're going to be using that for plotting later today. I've installed Zeus Python, which is an alternative Python implementation that has some neat features, which I'm not going to cover today, but it's there for you to experiment around with if you want. And I think that's basically it. Okay, so just to kind of wrap up, so package and environment management is critical if you want to have reproducible and portable workflows. So Conda is definitely a tool that you should invest the time to learn how to use effectively. It is platform agnostic and open source, so it'll run on Mac, Windows, or Linux. And it is open source, even though it's currently maintained by a commercial entity. The source code is on GitHub, and it has a big community behind it, and it's a really nice tool. Every project should have its own directory and its own environment, so this is the project-specific workflows that I want to encourage everybody to adopt. And the particular way of using Conda that I advocate is to install your Conda environment as a subdirectory within the project directory. So that keeps all of your project files and your entire software stack in one place, which just helps encapsulate everything a little better, and makes it easy because you use the same commands over and over again. No matter what project you're on, it's basically the same sequence of commands that I listed at the very top. So I use these commands on every project that I run, that I use. Okay, so at this point, before I move on, I want to open up for questions. So
Can I ask a quick question?
Yes.
So I'm always having a problem using Nano. How does it work?
I'm sorry, you're going to have to repeat that.
I'm always having problems using Nano, the function to create an environment.
You're having problems using Nano? Nano.
Yeah.
Yeah. Is that on? So you use Nano on Ibex, or I mean, so Nano is just a tool for creating a text file. It's a terminal-based text editor. So you can create the environment files with any text editor. Microsoft Visual Studio Code is the one that I typically use, unless I'm on Ibex, in which case I do sometimes use Nano. But the kind of proper use of Nano is a bit kind of off topic for this this particular training.
Okay.
So maybe we could kind of punt that question to one of the breaks, and we can talk about it then. Are there any questions about Conda, or just like conceptual questions about environment management or package management, things like this? Okay, I don't see anything in the chat, so I guess no questions. I'll check Gitter really quickly. Nothing on Gitter. Okay. Okay. Well, if nobody has any questions, we'll just go ahead and move on to the next episode. Okay. So running and quitting. So here we're going to cover the very basics of using Python. We're going to talk about, I'll walk you through the steps on launching the Jupyter Lab server, but that's already been done for us because we're using it in the cloud, so we don't need to launch the Jupyter Lab server itself. But we will talk about creating Python scripts and creating Jupyter notebooks and things like that, and then we'll just kind of play around with notebooks and see how we get on. Okay. So if we were doing this live, then normally we would have to activate the Conda environment that we would have created. But this has already been done for us on the BinderHub instance. We've already created the Conda environment, and it's been activated, and now it's running in the browser. So we don't have to worry about that so much. Sorry, just a moment. I want to get my teaching notes up on a separate screen, because mostly this is going to be hands-on from here on out, and I need to be able to refer to my notes and do live coding at the same time. Okay. So now we're going to get started with Jupyter Lab. So there's a few ways that you can write Python code. If you have experience coding in another language, you might have some kind of favorite text editor or integrated development environment for coding. Some of these IDEs, this integrated development environment, are language specific, but some of them are more language agnostic, and Python will surely be supported by any kind of language agnostic IDE or any text editor. If you don't have a favorite text editor, I would recommend Microsoft Visual Studio Code. That's the one that I use personally. It has fantastic support. There are instructions on how to install it on the setup page of the course materials. There's a server version of it, which is really nice because it means you can actually run Microsoft Visual Studio Code on remote servers. So you can use the server version to develop on ibex, for example, or on some remote server running on the public cloud, which is really cool and really handy. It would avoid you having to use something like Nano or some terminal-based text editor, which, whilst there are very powerful ones like Emacs and Vim, the learning curve on those tools is very high. So Jupyter Lab is a project to kind of create a interactive IDE-like environment that just runs in the browser. And it's particularly focused on, came out of the Ipython community. It's particularly focused on notebooks and Ipython consoles. But you can build kernels to run many languages, Julia, R, C++, Fortran. They all have their own kernels for Jupyter. So you can have notebooks and consoles for any of those languages running within Jupyter Lab itself. So it's included as part of Anaconda, but if you want it for your project, you can just include it in the environment.yaml file, like I've done here. And I actually have typically different versions of Jupyter Lab installed on my machine at any given time, depending on what I'm doing and things like that. Okay, so how does Jupyter Lab kind of work? Well, the basics with Jupyter Lab, like when we type code into a notebook or a console or a terminal, Jupyter Lab basically gathers that code up and kind of puts it in a little envelope. You can think of it as like packaging up a message in an envelope. The message contains the code that you want to run, and then that code gets sent to the backend, which is where the computation is actually done. And if you've installed Jupyter Lab locally, then that backend is, of course, whatever computer that you're running on. So the message that you type into the browser is collected and sent to the backend where the computation is performed. Then the results are gathered and put in a message and sent back to the browser and then rendered. That message could be an image, in which case it would render an image, or it could be the results of some calculation, in which case the calculation would be rendered. So the Jupyter Lab server is like the front end, so that's what we're looking at here. And then there's a back end where all the computation is actually done. So we're going to be typing code, into a notebook browser interface or a console browser interface or terminal or text file editor, and then any computation that needs to be done will typically be done on some on the machine on which Jupyter Lab server is running. Okay. So starting Jupyter Lab. So if we were running on our local machine, then once we have activated the environment where we've installed Jupyter, then the command to start the Jupyter Lab server is Jupyter Lab. And once you type Jupyter space lab and you hit enter, then a browser window will open up, and then you'll get this, what you see here, basically. So that's how you would start the server. Now, the BinderHub kind of spins up and starts the server for us, so we don't have to do that. But you'll get something that looks like this running in a browser on your computer. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the Jupyter Lab interface. So there's a menu bar. So this is the menu bar up here. So we have typical like file, edit, view, run, different things in the menu bar. Settings. Jupyter Lab is built to be kind of extended by the community, so you can build extensions to add functionality to Jupyter Lab. So there's quite a lot of flexibility that you can have. So you can, from the menu bar, you can create new consoles, notebooks, terminals, etc. So there, as you can see here, we have a launcher menu over here where we can do basically the same thing, or you can come up to File and launch these the same way. You can come to File to create a new launcher window, which basically will just create a new launcher window, and other things like that. So there's a notebook export. So notebooks can be converted to a variety of different formats. If we had a notebook open and active, then we could come to File, export this notebook, and PDF, LaTeX, Markdown, a bunch of other different formats. You can also shut down the server, and if we were logged into a particular instance, we could also just log out without shutting down the server. This kind of thing. Edit. You can see most of these are grayed out because we don't have any notebooks or consoles or anything open. But the edit menu would have all these different kind of options once we open a notebook. Same with view, run, and kernel. These are all grayed out because we don't have an active notebook or console or anything like that. So I'm going to teach a course on Git next week, next Tuesday, but there's Git support for doing version control from within Jupyter Lab and other stuff like this. So that's basically the menu bar. And then there's help. So if you are stuck on how to do something, come to the help menu. These will take you to different kind of reference materials online, things like that. Okay, so the left sidebar, sorry, let's just get rid of this. So the left sidebar is basically this area here. So the default setting is basically, it's like a file browser. So you can click through here and kind of navigate around to different directories. So today we'll be mostly in the Introduction to Python directory, and we have this data directory here. We have all of these CSV files. Jupyter Lab has CSV support, so we can open a CSV file and kind of browse through the data in our CSV file if we wanted to. And we've got these other text files in here. Jupyter Lab has support for a lot of different text formats, and so like the environment.yaml file was YAML formatted, so it does YAML syntax highlighting. The README file, this looks a bit messy. Just ignore that at the top. But then if you know how to write Markdown, which is kind of a text markup language, then it has Markdown support, so it gives highlighting for the different sections and things like that. And obviously Python scripts, we'll see those in a minute. Okay, so you can collapse the left sidebar by clicking on the folder. So that just kind of toggles it on and off. And then you'll have, depending on what extensions you have installed to Jupyter Lab, you'll have different options over here. So there's a Git extension, and if you're doing Git things, we'll talk about this next week, you could come in here and do some things with Git. You can go back to your file manager. There's also an extension installer to allow you to try to do live installs of extensions into a running Jupyter Lab. It's a bit of a prototype at this point. I typically install Jupyter Lab extensions before I build my environment. But the advanced Jupyter Lab topics are a bit out of scope for this course. Mostly I just want to teach you how to use Jupyter Lab as a basic interface to launch notebooks and consoles and things. So this brings us to the main work area. So the main work area for Jupyter Lab is this big area over here. By default, it's filled up with the launcher, but as we start creating notebooks and consoles, we'll be able to kind of break this space up into different different components depending on what we want to do. So you can divide up the main work area. For example, if I was to click on to launch a terminal, then I could come over here and create a new launcher, and then you can drag these around. So if I drag it down to the bottom, it's going to give me like a split screen view of my terminal here at the bottom and then my launcher here at the top. And then I could also create a new launcher. And if I wanted, I could create a text file. And notice that created a text file down here in my current, the current working directory. But now I could drag this guy around and kind of configure it like this. And so on and so forth. You can keep doing this. So if you wanted to, you can have, and you can adjust the size of these as well. So if you wanted to just have like a little terminal here at the bottom, and then do some kind of split screen at the top, between your like notebook or console, and then maybe this is a script over here that you're writing, like a Python script or something. So you can kind of drag these things around and configure your user interface however you want, basically. Okay, so I'm going to close kind of close these now, and then since I created this file over here, it's a bit we can clean it up. So if you select it, and then you can kind of right click, and that will bring up a menu of options for doing like normal things with the file, like renaming the file, deleting the file, duplicating it, downloading it, other things like that. So I'm just going to go to delete, and it's going to ask me, do you permanently want to delete this? Say yes. Okay, so that's basically deleting file within JupyterLab. Okay, so let's see how to create a Python script. So first, let's just go ahead and go into Introduction to Python. So by double-clicking on that, we have in the launcher menu now tells you what your current directory is. So that's Introduction to Python. And I'll further double-click on this source directory. Yep. And then inside this source directory, I'm going to create a text file, and just by clicking on the text file. And now if I rename this, so you can do right-click, rename, and I'll call this my first script .py. Now, JupyterLab will obviously do syntax highlighting for Python. So now that we have a .py file, we can start typing Python. So we can do import pandas as PD. We'll go through these. We'll go through these later, but I'm just going to kind of show you, that you get syntax highlighting. So if we wanted to import Numpy as NP, which is a linear algebra library, do things like that, and import. So standard import statements. And note that underneath, why is that not? Oh, that's okay. We'll talk about that later. So basic kind of syntax highlighting. So we could write our script in here, and then we could do something like print hello world. We could save it. So you can write your Python script here, and use JupyterLab kind of like as an IDE for writing scripts. Okay. So if you also wanted to create a notebook, then we need to create a new launcher window. And since I like to store my notebook separately from my source code, so if we'll go back up to Introduction to Python, and we'll create a new directory here. So we can create a new directory, and I'll call this notebooks. You can also, I think, have done that by doing file new. Well, it doesn't look like there's a new directory option here. So then the way to create a new directory would be to either click this new folder icon, or maybe right click. Yeah, you can right click inside of the left menu and do new folder, new file, things like that. But then inside our notebooks, now we'll click the notebook launcher. And when you click the notebook launcher, it launches a Jupyter notebook. And we can rename our notebook. Maybe we'll call it, I like to call my notebooks that I'm just playing around in a sandbox. So I will call it the sandbox. And then in here, we can write Python code. So import NumPy as MP. And we're going to talk a lot more about notebooks in a minute. And this is just kind of walking you through. I'll make this a little bit bigger, maybe to make it easier for everyone to see. Okay. But when you type Python code or notebook, you can hit Shift and Enter to execute the code. So that imported NumPy. But if we wanted to actually do some math, we can hit Shift Enter, and that would give us the result of 4. So we're going to do a lot more with notebooks in a minute. I just wanted to kind of show you how it would. Okay. Notebooks are written in a particular format called JSON. So even though the extension is IPyNB for notebook, it's actually written in a text format language called JSON, which is short for JavaScript Object Notation. And what's nice about JSON is it allows you to mix kind of source code, text, images, all kinds of stuff in a single file. And then browsers will understand how to render JSON, basically. And so that is what allows the browser to then make a notebook that looks nice like this, but still allows us to pass that notebook back to the back end of the server, and the server can then unpack the JSON and extract the code that we want to execute and execute it, and then return it to the browser in a way that the browser can understand. Okay. So there is an exercise in the notes. So if you just want to take a couple of minutes, I want to give you some practice with creating notebooks and Python scripts. So so here's kind of an example. I would encourage you. So you're not going to be able to generate any visualizations yet, but actually you can create interactive visualizations and have them kind of open as sections in JupyterLab as well. So let's just take a couple of minutes, get some practice creating Python scripts, notebooks, opening terminals and things, dragging the windows around to just kind of create create a work environment that you're happy with. And so I'll set a timer for just a couple of minutes. And then if anyone else has questions now, you can ask questions either in chat or on Gitter, or you can unmute yourself and ask some questions. Okay, so go ahead and take the next, whoops, wrong tab. Take the next 2 or 3 minutes and just have a play around with the arranging your kind of documents around in JupyterLab and get a sense of how that works. Okay? And until I get a question from somebody, I'll just kind of play around and do the same thing, kind of set it up in the way that I would normally set things up. So I would create a new launcher, terminal window. And oops. Oh, that's not what I want. I want, okay. So hopefully you had an opportunity to kind of play around and get a sense of how you might like to have Jupyter Lab set up for you. So what I have done is kind of set up how I would usually have Jupyter Lab running if I was going to do some kind of scripting work. So developing a script that maybe I was going to use to rerun some analysis later. So here I have an Ipython Console, which I didn't actually talk about before, but if you on a launcher, you have these Ipython consoles that you can launch, and they'll look like this. And then within Ipython consoles, you can actually run bash commands by putting an exclamation point in front of them. And then they have some magic commands. We'll talk more about this later. But here's an example where over here in Ipython console, I might experiment with different code. So I might do something like, 2 + 2. And then if you hit enter, then you get a multi-line code block that you can write in the Ipython console. So you have to actually hit shift and enter to get that code to execute. But as I kind of interactively type commands and these commands work, then the results will be rendered in the console over here. But then you could take this command and add it to your script. So print 2 + 2. And then if I went to run the script, I can actually press up to just toggle through my previous commands. And then if I hit shift and enter again, then the script presents the new output. Okay. So that's kind of one workflow that I would set up in way to run Jupyter Lab. Okay. So I'm just going to stop sharing just for a minute. Okay. I had a brief worry that I wasn't actually recording today's webinar, but I am actually recording it. So okay, so I can start going back to sharing my screen again. Okay. So let's kind of move along to using Jupyter Notebooks. Okay. So I'm going to go ahead and close these windows, just kind of get them all out of the way. I'm going to get my file browser back. Okay, so a common format or common way to use Python is kind of the way that I just kind of showed you. You've got a script, you've got my Python console, and maybe a terminal at the bottom. That's kind of a common IDE-centric kind of way of interacting with Python that you'll see supported in IDEs like Visual Studio Code. Notebooks are super popular for doing kind of quick prototyping and interactive workflows where you can actually write an entire scientific paper inside of a notebook that has like the text of your paper as well as all the code necessary to generate the results for your paper in one document. And if you're a real wizard with Jupyter Notebooks, then you can actually have that document compile to a PDF with LaTeX that has nice mathematical equations, and then just submit that straight away to a journal. So if you really want to go down the route of the kind of computational paper where you write papers that have the code kind of embedded in the paper, and then you automate the process of generating the PDF for your paper and making it journal ready, then you can do all of that with Jupyter Notebooks, basically. Okay, so let's go ahead and either open a new notebook, or if you created the sandbox notebook from earlier, you can just go ahead and open that. So the first thing to note is that, the notebook has command and edit mode. So if you click on a cell in a notebook, you'll see that there is a blue bar, or like a blue highlighted bar around the cell. And that's what lets you know that you're in edit mode. So edit mode is kind of what you would expect edit mode to be, which is like you're editing this cell in the notebook. So you're typing commands, you're deleting things, you're editing. So if you hit escape, notice that the blue highlight goes away, and now you're in command mode. And in command mode, you can do things like, if you go to edit now, you could cut this cell, you could delete the cell, you could move the cell up or down. So maybe if I click and go back to edit mode, I could type a comment that says, this is a code cell. And if I hit escape to go to edit mode, I could go to edit, and I could move that cell down, and it would just move the cell down. Now, you can also drag the cell and move it around that way too. So you can drag them up and down, or you can use these edit commands, and many of the edit commands map to keyboard shortcuts as well, to do things with the keyboard, or you can do it with the mouse and kind of just move things around like this. When you're in command mode, so you can always just press escape to make sure that you're in command mode. If you can use keyboard shortcuts to do things like create cells. Like I could hit, if I'm in command mode, I hit B, that will create a cell. So I've now created a new cell below. So I can click to go into edit mode. So this is the code cell that I just created. And then if I hit escape to go into command mode, there's another keyboard shortcut A, which will create a cell above the cell that you were currently located at. So this was the cell I created above the previous cell I created. Et cetera, et cetera. If you want to delete the current cell, you can hit, in command mode, you hit X, so that deleted. And then if you hit Z, that undeletes the previous cell. So that's just a handy thing to note. If you accidentally delete a cell, that's okay. You can hit escape to go into command mode and hit Z, and that will undo the deletion. You can also, again, in the edit menu, you could delete this cell, and then in the edit menu, you can do undo cell operation, which will bring the deleted cell back, things like this. Okay. So I've been mentioning code cells. So there's different kinds of cells in Jupyter Notebooks. There's code cells, and there are text cells. So for example, if I highlight a new cell and I'm in edit mode, and I can type, so this will be a text cell. So I type whatever I want to type, and then I can go up here and I can select from the drop-down menu code, and I can either make a raw text cell. And now if I hit shift and enter to evaluate this, it just gives me like the raw text that's actually there. If I select Markdown, then if I hit Shift and Enter, I get a Markdown cell. So in this, so if I double click to edit it, I can change Markdown cell, and then in here I can write Markdown. So I could, create things like a bulleted list. And now if I hit Shift Enter to execute this cell, it will get rendered, the Markdown will get rendered there in the notebook itself. So there's all kinds of stuff that you can do. Basically, Markdown will do almost, but not everything that HTML will do. You can actually write HTML in these cells. If you know how to code in HTML, you can write HTML code directly into the cell, and it will be rendered just as HTML would be rendered in a browser. You can mix and match the Markdown and HTML to an extent, and it will work. The lecture notes have a lot of different examples of different levels of heading, creating lists, creating numbered lists, adding links. So if I wanted to create a link, so I can go back in here, I'll just show you. So I could create link to today's workshop. How about this? I'll create a link to the software carpentry website. So I can put square brackets around the text that I want to embed the link in, and then I can put open and close parentheses, and then I just go get the link that I want. So software carpentry. So I go here and I grab the link, and then I can paste the link in here. And now if I hit Shift and Enter, it renders the link, and then you can go and click on the link, and it will open the link in a new tab, that kind of thing. Okay, so now there are some exercises that I would like you to take 5 minutes and go through these exercises. So there's some creating lists in Markdown. So basically, you can create some good practice creating bulleted and numbered and sublists. Play around with creating kind of valid arithmetic in Python, and then execute it as a code cell, and execute it as a Markdown cell, and maybe execute it as a raw text cell, just to see what happens in these different configurations. Here's an exercise about going back and forth with keyboard shortcuts between cell and Markdown, a code cell and a Markdown cell. And then you can embed LaTeX. So if you're familiar with LaTeX, if you can write math equations in LaTeX, then you can embed those math equations into Markdown cells and have them rendered in the browser. So just take 5 minutes and have a go at those exercises. And then if anyone has questions, again, now's a good time to either unmute yourself and ask a question, or ask a question in chat or on Gitter. And if I don't get any questions, then I will just noodle about with Markdown in JupyterLab, and maybe do some stuff in LaTeX and things like that. So there's a question about what do I need to do to keep my binder active? So basically just doing anything in like typing or opening a terminal or creating a file or any like clicks will keep it active. And again, if your binder happens to die for whatever reason, then you can just go back to the course website and then click on the appropriate link or dig the links out of the chat. Gotta check that I make sure I got that right. Even though it's one of my favorites, I always forget I pi plus 1, right? There's no negative in there. Let's see, what else can we do? So I'm kind of just demoing links and links and maths. So hopefully at this point, you'll get some sense of kind of just the basics of what you can have some sense of what you could use Jupyter Notebooks to do in terms of of embedding textual elements and code into one kind of document. They're great for prototyping. They're great for sharing kind of work that you're doing because you can kind of almost write like blog posts, interactive computational blog posts that you can save. But for production work, particularly for automating scripts and jobs on systems like Ibex or Shaheen, you're definitely going to want to learn to write Python scripts. So my own workflow, I tend to start out prototyping in Jupyter Notebooks. And then once I get things in a Jupyter Notebook that work and do kind of what I want, then I tend to kind of move the elements out of the notebook into a Python script that I can then run from start to finish to automate my entire workflow. Okay. So, so closing Jupyter Lab. So again, if you go to the menu bar and you go to File and you go to Shutdown, that would shut down your Jupyter Lab, and then you could close your browser, and then that would be it. If you're running locally, if you're running in the cloud, if you just close your browser, then the BinderHub will clean up all of your resources and things like that. You don't actually need to go and shut it down. Oh, I guess saving. So there's a little floppy disk icon up here for saving that you can click to save your notebook. Or you could do File, Save Notebook, or Save Notebook As. And again, you can export the notebook in different formats. Right. Okay. Any questions about like just the basics of Jupyter Lab, basic mechanics of running Jupyter Lab, running Ipython consoles, things like this?
Yeah, mister.
Yes.
I'm doing the exercise in the Python right now. Obviously, it's easy when I write like x equals 6 multiplied by 7. It can calculate it easily. But can I write like an equation? Is Python able to solve like an equation? I can write, for example, 2x plus x equal 3. Can I do so?
Yeah, so you can do, so what we've seen so far is just basically basic arithmetic, but you can write, all manner of scientific equations. You might just have to import some functionality first, and we're going to see examples of that. But I think in the question that you asked was like, well, we have x, what was it exactly? 6 times 7, okay. So if we define the variable x to be 6 times 7 plus 12, then you could do things like, 2 times x plus x cubed divided by x, that kind of stuff. So, we're going to cover, so this is about variables and assignment and other mathematical operations. We're going to cover that next, and then we're going to build into using obviously much more complicated and sophisticated libraries for doing mathematical analysis and data analysis and things like that. So this is basically just trying to make you comfortable with the user interface.
Yeah, thank you for that. And good to know that the power is like double, like the star.
Yes, 2 stars. Yes, we'll cover that explicitly in the next thing. Okay, good question. Any other questions? Okay, so that was a question that came up that I think Glendon already answered in the chat. Okay, well, let's move right along. What is a shell? So there's a question in the chat about what is a shell. So a shell typically refers to a terminal. Terminal and shell are kind of used interchangeably. So if somebody asked me, open a shell, I would go and open a terminal or things like that. Okay, but now I'm going to close that. All right, so let's move right along. Okay, so the next thing that we're going to cover is variables and assignment. So I will. So I'm going to keep track of all the commands that I'm going to write in this notebook or today. I'll just keep adding them to this notebook, and then at the end of the day, I'll save this notebook and I'll put it up on the GitHub repository. So then the next time, if you were to come back and launch the Binder instances again, for the fall 2020, they would have this sandbox notebook in there so that you could have a record of everything that I typed, in addition to obviously looking at the video if you wanted to see what I typed there. Okay, so variables, a variable is a name for a value. And in Python and most other programming languages, the equal sign is what actually assigns a value on the right-hand side of the equal sign to the variable, which is the name on the left-hand side. So, you might have a simple variable like x, and we use the equals to assign the value 3. So that's what the variable is x, the value is 3, and then the equal sign is the operator that assigns the value to the variable. And then we execute this code by hitting Shift and Enter. And then if we just hit Shift and Enter again in a notebook, we would get the value assigned to the variable. if you're in a Python script, you would need to put the print function around the thing that you wanted to display so that it would be printed out. So that's kind of one difference between a script and a notebook, or a script and an Ipython console, that if you actually want to print out something in a script, you need to actually use the print function. Okay. So let's see some other examples. So we can define a variable age and assign it to value 42, and we could define a variable first name and assign it to value Ahmed. And again, if we hit Shift and Enter, it will evaluate those two. And now we've assigned the values on the right-hand side to the variable names on the left-hand side. So just some syntactical issues. So valid variable names, only letters, digits, and the underscore are allowed for naming variables, or for defining variables. Typically, you'll see the underscore to denote as like a white space, in a sense. It's like you're using it to join two words in a longer variable. You cannot start a variable with a digit, so if you try to do something like this, you would get an invalid syntax error because you cannot start a variable with a number. What else? So variable names are case sensitive. So oops, it's really hard to type when you mix lower and uppercase like that. Don't do that in your variable names, my goodness. But they're basically case sensitive. So typically in Python, variables are all lowercase. And if you have multi-word, they'll be separated, or multi-word variable names will be separated by an underscore. Sometimes you'll see variable names that start with a single underscore or a double underscore. Typically, don't do that. That there's a particular convention for when and why you would want to have a leading underscore or a leading double underscore in a variable name, and until you understand the convention, you should avoid using those. And the convention is for advanced topics that are outside the scope of this introduction to Python, so you're not going to see me use it today. So again, if we want to print things, so there's a function print can be used to display things. So if we did print, and then we did our first name is age, something like this, then the print function will just kind of print out the things that we have put in here, separated by a space, kind of by default. Is what that does. And again, the print is a bit redundant in a notebook or an Ipython console, because if you evaluate a variable, it will automatically just return the string representation of that variable. But in a script, if you want to explicitly print something out, then you need to use the print function. So it's probably a good idea in your notebooks to get used to just using the print function if you explicitly want to print the value of something. That way, if you just copy the code from your notebook to a script, it will kind of do what you want in the script as well. So variables need to be created before they're used. So if I try to do something like print last name, I would get a name error because there's no variable last name, hasn't been defined anywhere. So we need to define it first. So as we've seen, kind of variables persist between cells. So here, I defined this variable in one cell, and then in another cell, I accessed the value of that variable and printed it out. And same here, like these variables, first name and age, are defined up here in this cell, but then printed out down here. So variables exist in between cells, and the order of execution matters. So here, if I try to evaluate this, this doesn't print, it raises an error. But if I do this, what would be a good last name? Jones. Then I can go and execute this, and now it actually prints something. So this is a demonstration that in notebooks, the execution is very can be out of order or very nonlinear. So you can bounce around a notebook and execute things not necessarily from top to bottom, but in many other orders. That can lead to some surprising behavior if you're not careful. When you're writing scripts, execution starts at the top and goes to the bottom. But in notebooks, it could be all over the place. So it's a good idea to minimize the amount of out of order execution. So for example, if I did something like this, then I would probably go back and move the last name above where it's actually used, so that I would get a correct result if I was to execute this code again. So out of order execution is something to be kind of avoided. And there's a useful in the lecture notes, there's a useful thing about if you go to kernel, you can restart the kernel, which will restart the notebook. And then if you wanted to run all cells, you could restart and run the whole notebook from top to bottom. So this is a way to catch any out of order execution errors that might creep into your notebook. If your notebook is not too computationally intensive to run from top to bottom, then when you're done your work for the day, you can save your notebook, restart the kernel, and run all the cells, and then just run top to bottom just to make sure that there isn't any like out of order execution errors that have crept into your code. Okay, so variables can be used in calculations. So we can take our age variable, which we defined earlier, and add 3 to it. And then if we print it out again, age in 3 years' time. So that's 3 more than what age previously was. With strings, you can, and so we've been working mostly with strings at this point, you can access the index in a string with indexing. So if I define a variable called DNA sequence, and then I put like AG, something like this, then you can refer to particular characters in that string by indexing. So Python indexing starts at 0. And so the 0th character in the string is going to be an A. The first character is going to be a G. And Python actually supports negative indexing, so that you can get the last character in a string by typing -1. And this is actually true for anything in Python that can be indexed, not just strings, but like lists and arrays and other things like that. So there's another example in the text or in the lecture notes. So you can do something else that you can do is slicing. So not just with strings, but as we'll see with like lists and arrays and things like that. So if we wanted to select out the first through the 4th, but not including the 4th, we would use syntax like this. So we have a start index and a stop index. And the start index is inclusive. The stop index is exclusive. So you will get G, C, and T. So that's 0, 1, 2, 3, but not including the 4th. So that's something to be aware of in Python. Another example of a built-in function, length. So if you wanted to act the length of our DNA sequence, that's just going to count the number of characters in the string. And again, Python in general is case sensitive. So I mentioned about variable names being case sensitive, but strings are case sensitive, so that will be false. And I guess that's the first example of how to check equality with the double equals operator. We'll see some more examples of that. So there is a question in the chat about documentation and help. So yes, I'm going to talk about that in the next episode. There's lots of different ways to get help. One way, just to show you one way, if you have a function and you want to get some help about the function, you can put a question mark and then execute that cell, and then it basically gives you what's called the doc string of the function, which gives you all of the syntactical options for the function, as well as a description of what those options do, as keyword arguments, things like that. So just put note, quick example of how to get help. Okay. All right, so there's some exercises here. So I want you to take 5 minutes and have a go at the exercises at the end of this lesson. And then maybe I'll pick one to demo when you're done. And so there's at the bottom, so there is swapping values, predicting values, and things like that. So have a look at these exercises over the next 5 minutes, and then we'll move on to the next episode. I'll go ahead and set a timer. So also now, if you have questions, feel free to ask them either in Gitter or in the chat, or unmute yourself and go ahead and ask your question.
David, can I ask a question about the exercise you're just typing at the moment?
Sure.
I don't understand why A1 will give you the index for the second number in your list.
So, okay, so basically, why does this give you 2?
Yes, exactly.
Instead of 1? It's because Python indexing starts at 0. So.
Oh, right. Okay. Yeah. Good. Okay.
Yeah. And that's different than, for example, I think MATLAB and R are 1-based. I know R is 1-based indexing. MATLAB might also be 1-based indexing, but that's a common sticking point for people who are new to Python. But it's a 0-based indexing.
Yeah, sure. Okay, thank you.
Okay. Okay, so that was about kind of 5 minutes just to quickly take a look at those exercises. Does anybody have any questions about the exercises? Is there a particular exercise that you want me to do live with the group? Otherwise, I'll just kind of sum up this episode and move on. Okay. Well, just to kind of wrap up, so the key points for this episode: variables store values. If you want to display things, use print. Even though you can display things in Ipython consoles and Jupyter notebooks just by executing a cell with the variable that you want to display, or the variable whose value you want to display, get used to using the print function. That way, when you move your code from your notebook to your script, it will still print out as expected. In notebooks and in Ipython consoles, variables persist between cells. Remember to create your variables before they're used. You can use variables in calculations. We saw some examples of that. Python is 0 indexed, so indexing starts at 0. You can use slicing to get like a substring or a subsection of actually anything that can be sliced, like lists or arrays. We'll see examples of that. Slicing includes the first element, but not the last element. So it's inclusive on the lower end and exclusive on the upper end. So includes start up to, but not including stop. There's a built-in function lang. We also saw print. I demoed one called in the notebook called string, which converts something to a string. We'll see many more of these. Python is case sensitive and use meaningful variable names. So, a good example. There's an exercise on this. So between these three, so this is almost something like you would see. This is very like MATLAB. So in MATLAB, you see a lot of like write code as math. And so you have a lot of short variable names. Whereas in my mind, this third option is the best of the three. Meaningful variable names almost act as self-documenting code, particularly in a language like Python, where you can write code that is almost reads like English in many situations. Okay. So there's a question in the chat about what is the importance of moving code from a notebook to a script or console. the answer is it kind of just depends on how you want to work. For me, notebooks are about either prototyping something, that a workflow that I just want to get started interactively. I want to look at some plots interactively. I want to do some interactive data analysis just to see kind of what's going on. But then if I want to run analysis on like a remote server or a remote computing cluster, then I would convert my notebook to a script, either by copying out the relevant parts of my notebook and putting them in a script, or you can actually convert a notebook to a Python script. And why am I not seeing the there used to be an option for doing that, and now it seems to have moved to some place where I don't know where it is. But basically, you can convert your Ipython notebook directly to a script and then run it. So it kind of just depends on what you're doing. Okay, so let's move right along. So actually, this is probably a good point to take a short break. So let's go ahead and take just a 15-minute break, and then we will resume at 11 o'clock with the next episode. We've been going pretty hard now for almost 2 hours, so I think it's probably a good time to go ahead and take a break. So I'm going to go ahead and pause the recording, and then we'll pick it up in 15 minutes. Okay. So welcome back. So we're going to get started then with just the second half of this morning's workshop. So the plan is to probably go for about another hour until noon, and then we'll take our lunch break until 1 o'clock, and then we'll resume the afternoon session at 1 o'clock. You should have received a separate invite for the Zoom meeting this afternoon. It will be in a different meeting link. I'll be sure to remind you of that at the end of this morning's session. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen, and then we will pick up with so create a little cell in here, call this data types and type conversion. Okay. So this episode, I'm going to try to go through this episode pretty quickly to get on to some more meatier topics. But it is important. So we need to talk about what kind of data programs can store and how do you convert types back and forth to one another, just so you have some sense of how that process works. Explain the difference between integers and floating point numbers. So this is important for doing numerical work, and differences between numbers and strings, and how to convert back and forth between the basic types, which are integers, floating point numbers, and strings. Okay. So every value has a type. There is an integer type, which represents numbers like 3 or 5 or negative 1 million. There's floating point numbers, which represent real numbers. So like 3.14, negative 2.5, things like this. So these are floating point numbers. And then there are strings. And we've been working mostly with strings so far. So strings are basically just text data. So there is a built-in function called type, which can be used to get the type of any value. So if we ask for the type of 32, we're going to get an int. If we ask for the type of 3.14, we're going to get a float. So that's like a floating point number. And then if we ask for the type of 3.14 in quotation marks, we'll get a string. So types are what control the kinds of things that can be done with a value. So if we did 5 minus 3, so this is using the subtraction operator on two things that are type int and type int. And so subtraction is defined for integers, and so you get kind of the output 2, which is what obviously what you would expect. But if you try to do something like hello minus h, you as a human might look at that and think, well, you know, maybe the result should be hello, you know, hello, but removing the h. But subtraction, this operator minus, the subtraction operator is not defined for types string and string. So this is the example of a type error, which is an error that's generated when you try to do something that is invalid given the type of data that you're operating on. Now, some mathematical operations are actually defined for strings. So for example, if you were to do hello plus h, then that does what's called string concatenation. So basically, takes two strings and just glues them together. You could also do multiplication. And this basically just takes a string and replicates it, and then concatenates the result. Okay, so strings have a length, and we saw this earlier. So you can the length of the string. I'll just make up another kind of little DNA sequence. So that has a length, but the length of a number is going to give you a type error because there's no notion of a length for an integer. So you also can't generally do things with mixed type. So if you try to add a number and a string, you'll get an error. But if you convert using these functions, like if I convert the string, if I convert the number 1 to a string and then add 2, so that gives you the string 12. And that's because this string function converts the 1 to a string and then concatenates the string 2, which just kind of glues them together and gives you 12. You could also convert the string 2 to an integer and add it to the integer 1, and then that gives you 3. So you can convert back and forth between different types. One thing that you can do is you can mix integers and floats. So if you do 1 divided by 2.0, you'll get 0.5. So that's kind of what you would expect. You can also take a floating point number and exponentiate it, so we can cube it. So that's basically exponentiating a floating point number with an integer. So that works, that's fine. So variables only change values when you assign something to them. So if I start with a variable first and I assign it to value 1, and then I say the variable second is going to be 5 times the variable first. And then I reassign first to be 2, and then I print out the string first is first, and second is second. So it prints the result 2 and 5. Well, and the reason is that this variable second has its value assigned at the time that first has the value 1. Then we changed first value. So when we print it out, we get the new value for first, but the value of second doesn't change. So this is important because this is different than, if you're used to working in Excel with Excel formulas, values in cells will update when the value, or values in the formula cell will update when the values in the cell change. So Python is very different. Most programming languages are very different than an Excel notebook in that sense. Okay, so just want you to take 3 minutes and have a look at the exercises at the end of this episode. And I'll just give you an opportunity again to ask any questions that you might have. So some fractions, type conversions, and choosing types. So just go ahead and take a look at these exercises. They're pretty quick. So I'll just put 3 minutes on the timer. And then feel free to ask me any questions that you might have. So there's a question in the chat about the length of a vector. So we haven't actually talked about arrays yet, but anything that's like a vector, you could use the length function to compute the length of that. So later this afternoon, we'll see NumPy arrays and pandas, series, and data frames and things like that, and we'll see how to handle those cases when we get there. If you wanted to look at a built-in type, so you could take something like a list, where we could have a list of numbers, or you could actually, in a list, you can put different types of things. So we could put a string in here as well, and a floating point number. And then you can compute the length of a list in that fashion. But we'll cover arrays and data frames and things like that probably after lunch, or maybe a little bit before lunch. So it's possible that your if you hit Shift and Enter and nothing happened, then that probably means that your session has timed out. And so you'll just need to go back to the GitHub repo for the course and then relaunch the BinderHub again. So I'll put the link. So if your Jupyter Lab session timed out, then visit this link and relaunch. So basically, just if you're outside of CAUS, you just click on the public Jupyter Lab. If you're inside CAUS, you can click on the CAUS BinderHub. Okay. So any questions about the data types, ints, strings, things like that, or anything else?
Yes, I have a question.
Yes.
When I solve the exercise, there is something, it's like a float class. What is this? A class float, sorry.
So the class, in some respects, the class is is a particular instance of a kind of type, I guess would be the way to think about it. But for our purposes, you can just focus on the types and forget about the class. So if you print, I think what you're talking about is that if you ask for the type of an integer, then you get its type. But if you actually print out the type, then you get that. Now, so basically, the string, whenever you print something out, you get the string representation of the thing that you're printing. And the string representation of the type is basically a representation called a class, which basically just shows you what class this type is. So it's not an important distinction, I would say.
I got it. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Any other questions? Okay. So then let's move right along to the next episode, which is on built-in functions and help. Okay, so in this episode, I'm going to cover a few more built-in functions and then talk about some errors, and then we'll see how to get help, basically. So just a quick aside, I realized that there was something that I had been doing which I hadn't talked about, which is adding comments. So here's an example of a comment. So you can use this hash symbol to, so this is a comment and will be ignored. So if I was just to execute this, nothing happens because this is a comment and it's ignored. So then if I put some actual code, then it ignores the comment and just executes the code. So that's something to know. And you can put comments, either can be above, or you can actually have inline comments, which, so if I just had some code here, and so this is an inline comment. So basically the code, everything over here will be executed and everything over here will be ignored. Okay. All right, so we've seen some built-in functions already. So len, int, stir, and float, and print. And so functions can take 0 or more arguments. So for example, if we did print and before, and print with no arguments, print with one argument again, and we execute this. So print with no arguments basically just prints a blank line. So there's some other functions like max, min, and round. So if we wanted to compute the max of some numbers, we can compute the max of the numbers. If we wanted to do the min, we could do the min, and if we put in here strings, and notice you can use single or double quotes for strings. It doesn't matter as long as you're consistent. So you can't do something like this, but as long as you're consistent, you can use either. Okay. So here we're going to, what is the min of these characters? Well, the min is actually 0, and we can kind of just play around with this to try to figure out what the ordering over these strings is. So if we compared the min and the max, and then so the min of these characters basically is 0. So we know that the numbers, the string representation of a number will come first, followed by uppercase letters, followed by lowercase letters, it would appear, since the max returns A. So you can kind of play around with that just to see min and max. You can't do min of mixed types. So even though you can take the min of a collection of numbers and the min of a collection of characters or strings, if you try to mix the types, then you get a type error because the less than operator, which is what is used to determine the minimum value of something, you can't basically, there's no way to compare the integer 1 and the string A in any sensible way. So that's why you get a type error. So basically, if you want to compute the min and the max of something, either the type has to be have a meaningful way to compute the less than. You have to be able to order things of a particular type if you want to use min and max and things like that. There's also a function round. So round. So by default, it looks like rounds to the nearest integer. So how could we round to different decimal places? So there's actually a second argument on round, which is the number of decimal places that you want to round to. But this brings us to a good point to talk about help, because it's like, well, how do I know what the default behavior of round was? I mean, obviously you can try it and see what it does, but how did I know that there was this extra argument that you could specify? And so that brings us to the topic of help. So there are a few ways to get help. One is the help function itself. So if I do help round, then that brings up a simple help menu, which tells you that this function round takes a number and then this keyword argument in digits, which allows you to specify the precision in decimal digits. And it tells you that it will return an integer if in digits is omitted or none. So that gives you kind of a help menu. There are other ways to get help. So if you do round and a question mark, you can get the doc string. So this will give you a doc string. You can also do round, and then if you put your cursor inside the parentheses and you hit Shift and Tab, then this will pop up the same information, but in a little dialog box. That goes away as soon as you start typing. So there's a question in the chat about multi-line comments that I see Glendon answered. So you can do multiple line comments with triple quotes. You can either do triple double quotes. And then so this is a multi-line comment. Everything here will be ignored. And again, you can also do single quotes. But the important thing is that they match. So this will give a syntax error because Python sees triple single quotes and thinks, this is the start of a multi-line comment, and then goes comment, 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 there's no end to the triple quotes, and then it throws a syntax error. So if we change these to single quotes, then it's fine. Personally, I tend to use double quotes for strings. And then if I'm doing characters, I use single quotes, but that's mostly because when I learned to program in other languages that are pedantic about strings versus characters, and strings and characters are different types, you denote a character by single quotes. But really, as long as you're consistent, either of them is fine. Okay, so that was a quick cover of help. So now I want to talk about the two basic kinds of errors that you can get. So syntax errors and runtime errors, and the difference between the two. So syntax error, we've seen a few examples of these already. It's basically Python doesn't understand what you have written. It's not valid Python. So if you do something like this, and you forget to close your quote, then this is a syntax error. That's not the Python interpreter, which takes your text that you type in and then has to interpret it into Python bytecode before it can be executed, doesn't understand how to interpret what you've written. So that's a syntax error. Another simple syntax error would be if you put an extra space in between the double equals operator, that will give you an invalid syntax. And notice that, so this syntax error is actually quite good. It tells you basically what the issue is, and it points exactly to where you've missed the closing double quote. This one's a bit vague, right? It just says invalid syntax and points to the point at which the Python interpreter broke. And so, that usually is enough to kind of give you a little bit of hint of where the syntax error is. Another common one might be, well, these type of errors used to be common. So if you leave out a closing parenthesis, then this will give you an error. But notice that it's really hard to make this kind of a mistake, because when you Jupyter notebooks and Ipython consoles and most text editors for coding will autocomplete things like closing bracket or closing parentheses, closing brackets, closing quotes, things like that. So it's hard to make this kind of mistake. And just as a reminder, the double equals operator tests for object equality. So in this case, it's going to say, is the integer 2 equal to 4? And that's false. But 2 is exactly equal to 2. Okay. We'll talk some more about that later. So that's a syntax error. So syntax errors are generally quite easy to debug because they're immediate. Particularly once you learn a little bit about Python. Like when you're just getting started, you're going to make lots of syntax errors. But the syntax errors are immediate, and you can usually quickly fix them. The other type of error is a runtime error, and that happens when you've written code that is syntactically correct. So there's nothing that is there's nothing that's syntactically wrong about this code, but it generates a runtime error. And this is a name error. This name error is an example of a runtime error. And this is easy to happen. So this is just a small typo here. So I've just added this extra E, which creates a variable that's not defined anywhere. And so when the Python interpreter interprets this code, it says, well, this is syntactically valid Python. I'm quite happy with this, and translates it into Python bytecode that then is executed to actually run the computation. But then during the phase in which the code is executed, it then tries to find a value for this variable and can't find one, so it raises a runtime error. Now, runtime errors are can be much more difficult to debug. This one is fairly straightforward, but they also can be quite expensive in the sense that here, this typo in this interactive notebook I immediately get this runtime error, and I can immediately fix it, and then get the answer, or the code works. But imagine that instead of this like 2-line code that we're running interactively, imagine that this code appeared in a Python script that you had included as a job on some remote cluster like Ibex, and your job had been running for several hours, and then it hits this line in the code where this variable is not defined, and then throws an error, and the results of your job are basically useless at that point. You have got to start over. So runtime errors, that's why you do debugging, and that's why you do prototyping interactively, to try to make sure that your code works properly and that there are no runtime errors before you go and launch some big, multi-hour or multiple day kind of job, basically on a cluster. So just another quick kind of aside about functions, that every function returns something. So if we wanted to assign a value to the variable result from print example, so what we get is the example is printed to the screen, because that's an effect of the print function. And if we were to look at the result, well, it seems like there's nothing there. But if we actually look at the type of result, it tells us it's a none type. And that's because every function returns something. Even if it returns none, then it returns the only instance of the none type, basically. And then we would see that if we actually tried to print the result is result, we get the result is none. Okay. All right, so let's take just a couple of minutes and look at those exercises at the end, which is just some extra practice with some built-in functions and familiarizing yourself with help and things like that. And there's an example of complex numbers. If you work with complex numbers, then Python has types for complex numbers and things like that. It can do complex arithmetic and everything. Okay, so I'm going to set the timer just for 3 minutes again. So just go ahead and take a few minutes to look at those exercises, and then we'll move on if there's no more questions. And if there are questions, you can ask them in chat, you can ask them in Gitter, or you can unmute yourself and go ahead and ask now. Yeah, actually, the exercises that I wanted you to do, that was the wrong notebook, are these here. Okay, so are there any questions about those exercises? Okay, so I'm going to cover the last exercise because it illustrates something that that's important and useful and is a reminder about the impact of zero-based indexing with Python. So if we have a string or an array.
Excuse me, I have a question.
Yes.
It's about the computation of radiance. I don't know if you can see the exercise. So I don't quite understand how Python computes the radiance that you give in that exercise.
Okay, let me finish this bit here, and then we'll go through that exercise together.
Thank you.
So if you have anything that you can index, if you want to select the last element in that sequence, you can use this -1 to kind of select it out. But another way is, we can compute the length. So indexing uses integers for indexing. So if we wanted to compute the length of the thing, we can find out its length. And then if we try to use its length to compute the last element, if we just use the length by itself, we get string integer out of range. And that's because because of the zero-based indexing. So what we need to do is subtract off 1. So that's, so this is another way. My preferred way is just to use the negative and take advantage of the negative indexing that Python has and do it the way that I showed you earlier. Okay, so there was a question about the radiance exercise. And so here we defined the variable radiance to have a value of 1, and then we reassign it as follows. We've got, so the max of 2.1, 2.0 plus the min of the radiance 1.1 times the radiance minus 0.5. Okay. Invalid syntax. Right, okay, so that's because we didn't assign it. All right, well, let's not assign it just for now. So the question is, why does this become 2.6? Okay, so what happens is that, so first we assign radiance the value of 1. Yep. And then we come down here and we have this nested function called. So what will be evaluated first is this inside function. So the min will be evaluated first. So I'll just copy this out. So min gets evaluated, and it gets evaluated by replacing radiance with the value that its current value is 1. And so now we just do some arithmetic and figure out what is the answer to this. So we get this. Then we can replace 0.6, and then we compute the max of these two values, which gives us 2.6. So basically, when you have a nested function, it's the value of the inner function that is going to be computed first. So any computation that's required to generate the value of this inner function will be done first, and then the outer function will be computed. So hopefully that, Paul, hopefully that answers your question.
Yes, thank you very much.
You're welcome. Okay. So let's move right along. There's another question. Okay, good. This is the so this is a nice exercise. So copy and paste it in here, and I'll just execute it. And so basically the question is, why do we get the result that we get? And in particular, why does this statement print 10? Okay. So I'll walk through that. So first, the easy string. So the easy string is just ABC. And so if you compute the max of easy string, the max of easy string is just C. So that makes sense because we've got, the string ABC is composed of 3 characters, and alphabetically C comes after A, so it seems like C should be the answer. So that's fine. But then what about this? So again, with why is this 10? So with nested function calls, this function, max of rich and poor, is going to be computed first. And so then the question is, well, why is poor greater than rich? Well, in order to figure out why poor is greater than rich, you need to compare the strings that are the values that are assigned to those variables. So when you're comparing the values that are assigned to those variables, you're actually comparing gold and 10. And the reason that gold is less than 10, the string gold is less than the string 10, is that when you compare strings, you start by comparing characters. So you compare, is the lowercase g less than lowercase t? And the answer is yes, because alphabetically g comes before t. And this is another example of how variable naming can matter, is that here assigning the value of the variable rich to the string gold and the variable poor to the string 10 then leads you to this really crazy, visually you look at that and you say, if I print the max of rich and poor, your brain wants to say, well, the thing ought to be rich and therefore it ought to print gold, but obviously that's not what's going to happen. So it's a bit of a brain teaser. Okay, good. I'm glad that you guys are asking questions. It's good. So let's move on then to the next episode. Morning coffee. We're well past that. Libraries. So in this episode, we will cover about what are libraries and why are they so powerful. And then we'll probably not have time to really get too much into pandas. And so we'll probably pick up with data analysis and pandas after lunch, I think, rather than try to get started and then not be able to finish. So in this episode, we're going to cover basically how to use software that other people have written, how to find out what software does, explain why software libraries, kind of what the concept of software library is, talk about how to import modules from Python standard library, and then we're going to talk about how to find libraries that are not in the Python standard library, like pandas and NumPy and all those things after lunch. Okay. So the power of programming language is in its libraries. Both the libraries are included as part of its standard library, which just comes when you install the language itself, and also the ecosystem of libraries that are created around the standard library. So Python and R have huge communities, global communities of users who are creating libraries that extend the base programming language to do new and interesting things. And it's those libraries that really make Python powerful, or any programming language powerful. Python has become the standard language for data science and machine learning because of this ecosystem of libraries for doing data analysis and machine learning and accelerating your data analysis on the GPU and things like that. And it's these libraries that have made Python so widely adopted. So there's a link here to the Python standard library. If you open it in a new tab, you can see this is the documentation for the most recent version of Python, which is 3.8.6. And you can see that there are a huge number of standard libraries that are included as part of the Python standard library for doing text processing, different data types, for working with these are kind of built-in data types, doing date time things, counter things, collections of things, sorting algorithms. There's some stuff built in for doing numerical and mathematical modules, random number generation, basic mathematical functions. We'll end up using some of these just as examples, but primarily we'll be using Numpy and other scientific libraries for these functions. Some interesting tools for doing functional programming, accessing data, different file formats for I/O, things like this, doing concurrent execution, a lot of web development stuff. Other than like scientific computing and machine learning and data science, there's a whole huge sub-community within Python for doing web development. And there's just a ton of stuff. So you can kind of go through here and see like the standard library and everything that is included in the standard library. Then there's the Python package index. And the Python package index is where Python users who create their own Python packages and libraries can publish them so that other people can install them and use them. And right now there is over 264,000 projects contributed by 455,000 active users who have kind of contributed their software so that it can be installed and used by other people. And so this is where some of our some packages that are installed via a tool called pip will install packages from the Python package index. Okay. In order to use code from a particular library, however, you have to import it before you can use it. So let's see some examples of this. So I'm going to make another cell, libraries. So if you want to use some code from the built-in math library, then you need to import it first. So if we import math, then we can do things like print the value of pi is math.pi. And math dot, my tab completion is not working properly. Figure that out. So when you reference things in reference functionality from a library, then you would do math dot and then the thing that you want to reference. So here my tab completion is not working for some reason, so I'll just take a look at the help menu for the math module or library, and you can see all of the functions and things that are included in math. And then, so these look like they're all functions. So somewhere in here, yeah, so here are some data. So here constants E, there's a representation for infinity, a representation for not a number, pi, and tau, which is another numerical constant, which I believe is just twice pi. Then there are functions, so we can access any of these functions in here using our math.syntax. So we could do math.cosine of math.pi and get -1, for example. So sometimes you might not want to import an entire module, but rather only certain functions from the module. So you could do import So from math, import the cosine function and the constant pi. And then you could write something like cosine of pi, just like this. Another option is to import a module and give it an alias. So you could do, so I typically avoid this kind of importing because here it's unlikely that I would define my own cosine function or my own variable called pi. But if I had, and then I imported something like this, it would overwrite my own definitions. So instead, what I tend to do is either import the module or package or library. Those are all interchangeable terms for the same thing, or give it an alias. If I don't want to type math all the time, I can do import math as m, and then I could do m.cosine of m.pi. So that's why we'll see later, common convention is to import libraries like NumPy as NP, or pandas as PD, or things like that, to give these short aliases so you don't have to type the full name of the module over and over. That kind of thing. Okay. So there are some exercises. So what I would like to do is just take 5 minutes and have a look at the exercises, and then we'll do a short Q&A, and then we'll break for lunch. And then we'll pick up with data analysis after lunch. So the exercises that I want you to look into are at the bottom of the libraries lesson. So it's basically some practice with importing and playing around with the math module. This is an interesting puzzle here. It kind of gives you most of the code that you need to write, but it's all scrambled in a different order. And so can you kind of rearrange that code to correctly give the result that it's asking for? So I'll set a timer for five minutes just to take a look at those exercises, and then we'll do Q&A, and then we'll break for lunch. And then, as always, kind of if you want to unmute yourself and ask a question, I'm happy to take questions now. Otherwise, you can chat or Gitter. Otherwise, I'll just play around with the math module.
Excuse me, I have a question.
Yes, Paul.
What is the major difference between the math library and the NumPy library?
So that's a good question. So the major difference is that the NumPy library operates on a specific data type, which is called the NumPy array, and it's an n-dimensional array. So you could have, a two-dimensional array like the matrix, or a three-dimensional array, which would be a tensor, and then you can just have as many dimensions as you want. And then all of the mathematical functions in NumPy are designed to operate efficiently on these n-dimensional arrays. And the code on which all of these numerical computations is done is actually written in low-level C++ or Fortran, depending, and is compiled and is very, very fast. Whereas these math functions are only operate on simple data types like integers or floating point numbers.
Okay, but can we use it interchangeably instead of using math library, and we can use NumPy? Is that possible?
So what you can do is you can, if you were to import NumPy, then NumPy has its own square root function. And if you ask it for the square root of 4, it will give you the same answer as you get if you do math square root of 4. But NumPy also operates on arrays. So if you were to give it, or something that is like an array, so if you were to do something like this, NumPy will compute the square root of all of these numbers. And if you were to try the same thing, but with the math library, I don't think it will work. Yeah. So it will give you a type error. So NumPy is about doing mathematics on kind of arbitrarily large arrays of numbers. And math is more for doing simple, is for doing math, but with either typically real numbers, integers, floating point numbers, things like this. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you. It's very clear now.
Okay. Okay, so hopefully you've had a chance to go over those exercises. Are there any questions about the exercises? Any particular exercise that you would like me to go through as a group? Okay. In that case, it's a good time to break for lunch. I'll hang around for the next 4 or 5 minutes to give everybody an opportunity to ask any questions that they might want to ask. Otherwise, we'll break here for an hour and we will resume at 1 p.m. for the afternoon session. Remember that there's a different meeting link for the afternoon session. So you should have received 2 emails yesterday with the Zoom meeting link for the morning and the Zoom meeting link for the afternoon. So we'll see you this afternoon, but with a different meeting link. Okay? So I'll hang around, Glenda and I will hang around for the next few minutes to see if anybody has any questions, but otherwise, bye-bye, and I will see you after lunch. Okay, I'm getting a few questions about not receiving the afternoon link. Let me dig it out. I will post it here in the chat for you. I guess that's one way that I could send it. You should also contact Jerry. If you're in Jerry's class, you should contact Jerry because he will also have the email and he can send it to you. But I will just dig it out now and share it. Oh, so I'm sending up the meeting link for this afternoon in the chat. And then if you're in Jerry's class, please ask Jerry if he can share the meeting link with everybody who's in his class, because I know that there are 100 some odd people who are taking his course, and I don't have everybody's emails for that.
Yeah, thanks so much, David. I just received the email from his assistant yesterday, but this is for the meeting in the morning. So I was wondering if
Yeah. So absolutely. So reach out. I would reach out to his teaching assistant and let him know that there were 2 links that were sent out, a morning and an afternoon link, and he probably just forgot or didn't realize that there were 2 links, and he'll send it out. Okay, so unless there are any more questions, so it's 12, so I'm going to sign off and go get some lunch, and then I will see you guys at 1 o'clock. Okay, cool. Well, everybody have a nice lunch, and I'll see you in about an hour.